January 17, 1940. Borkum Island, North Sea. The wind cuts across the flat expanse of sand and concrete like a blade forged in the Arctic. A young Luftwaffe technician named Klaus Becker stands on the frozen tarmac of a coastal radar station, his breath visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Above him, the skeletal frame of a Freya early warning radar rotates slowly, its metal arms sweeping the sky for ghosts that have not yet arrived. The machine hums with electric certainty, a mechanical heartbeat that promises Germany an invisible shield. Becker adjusts his leather gloves and checks his logbook. The entries are routine: range, azimuth, altitude. Everything the Rye needs to know about what approaches from the west. In this moment, standing beneath that turning steel sentinel, he believes his nation has mastered the sky. He believes that technology has rendered the night transparent, that German precision has conquered invisibility itself. The war is 5 months old, and the confidence in Berlin is absolute. The Führer's engineers have given the Luftwaffe eyes that pierce darkness and distance. What Becker does not yet understand, what none of them can imagine, is that on the other side of the North Sea, in the cluttered laboratories and converted manor houses of southern England, a different kind of seeing is being born. A vision not of where the enemy is, but of how to deceive the very eyes that search for you. The story of radar in the Second World War is not simply a tale of invention, but of perception itself, of how nations came to understand that modern war will be fought not only with bombs and bullets, but with invisible waves that map the sky, and with the cunning required to render those maps meaningless. Germany entered the war with a technological head start that seemed insurmountable. By 1939, the Reich had deployed the Freya and Würzburg radar systems, machines of remarkable sophistication that could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 kilometers and guide night fighters with unprecedented accuracy. These were not crude devices. They were the products of years of methodical research, engineering triumphs that embodied the German faith in Technik, the belief that superior technology, rigorously applied, would deliver victory. In the early months of the war, this faith seemed justified. British bombers attempting night raids over Germany were tracked, intercepted, and destroyed with efficiency that shocked RAF Bomber Command. The losses were staggering. Crews that departed English airfields in darkness often never returned, their aircraft shattered by fighters that appeared as if summoned by sorcery from a black void. The Germans called it Himmelbett, heavenly bed, a defensive system that divided the night sky into boxes, each monitored by radar, each a trap waiting to close around intruders. For the men who operated these systems, there was pride, even arrogance. They had transformed night from an ally of the attacker into a killing ground. But war is a dialogue, and every advantage invites a response. In Britain, a different philosophy was taking shape. Where German radar engineers had focused on precision and power, British scientists began to explore not just detection, but disruption. The concept was heretical. Instead of building better eyes, why not blind your enemies? This was the origin of what would become electronic warfare, a discipline that treated the electromagnetic spectrum as a battlefield unto itself. The men who pioneered this work were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were physicists, mathematicians, radio enthusiasts who had been pulled from universities and private industry into a war effort that valued their peculiar talents. At the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern and in the secret laboratories of IAF Bomber Command, they studied captured German radar components, analyzed intercepted signals, and began to map the invisible architecture of the Reich's defenses. What they discovered was both elegant and vulnerable. German radar operated on specific frequencies, used predictable pulse patterns, and relied on operators who had been trained to trust their screens absolutely. The British began to ask a simple, devastating question: what if those screens could be made to lie? The first answer came in the form of window, strips of aluminum foil cut to precise lengths corresponding to German radar wavelengths. When dropped from aircraft in large quantities, these metallic strips would flutter through the air, each one reflecting radar signals and appearing on German screens as individual aircraft. The concept was stunningly simple, almost absurdly so. Paper-thin metal, scattered like confetti, could multiply a single bomber into a phantom armada. The technology required no exotic materials, no advanced electronics. It was a trick of physics, a manipulation of the enemy's own sophisticated systems against themselves. But simplicity did not mean insignificance. The potential impact was so enormous that the British Chief of Staff initially refused to authorize its use, fearing that Germany would immediately copy the technique and employ it against British defenses. For 2 years, window remained a secret weapon, stockpiled but unused, while IAF crews continued to die in numbers that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. By the summer of 1943, the calculus had changed. Bomber Command's losses over Germany had become unsustainable. Entire squadrons were being decimated in single raids. The average life expectancy of a bomber crew had fallen to a handful of missions. Something had to break this defensive stranglehold, and the decision was made: window would be deployed. The target was Hamburg, Germany's second-largest city and a vital industrial center. The raid was scheduled for the night of July 24, 1943, and it would mark a turning point not just in the bombing campaign, but in the very nature of technological warfare. The crews who loaded their aircraft that evening in eastern England were told only that they would be dropping special bundles along with their bombs, that these bundles would help protect them. Most did not understand the mechanism. They did not need to. As the sun set and the Lancasters and Halifaxes roared down runways into the gathering dark, the men inside them carried more than high explosives. They carried the means to make the German night blind. Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann sits in the radar hut at Stade, northeast of Hamburg, his eyes fixed on the circular green glow of his Würzburg scope. It is 0:57 hours on July 25th, and the first reports are coming in from the coastal Freya stations, a large formation approaching from the northwest. This is routine. The British come often, and the Himmelbett system is ready. Hoffman's station is responsible for a sector of sky 15 kilometers wide, a box through which enemy bombers must pass to reach Hamburg. His job is to detect them, calculate their altitude and heading, and vector night fighters into position for the kill. He has done this dozens of times. The process is mechanical, reliable. He watches as a first contact appear on his screen, bright blips moving steadily southeast. He reaches for his radio handset to alert the fighter control center, but something is wrong. Where there should be a dozen blips, there are suddenly hundreds. The screen erupts with returns, a blizzard of contact that fills his entire sector and spills into adjacent ones. His first thought is equipment failure, but the Würzburg is functioning normally. All around him, other operators are shouting, their voices climbing in pitch. Every station from the coast of Berlin is reporting the same phenomenon. The sky has become solid with targets, an impossible armada that defies every estimate of British bomber strength. Hoffmann does not yet have a word for what he is seeing. Doppel, the Germans will eventually call it, adopting the name of the Berlin suburb where their own research into radar countermeasures has been conducted too slowly, too cautiously. But in this moment, he has no framework for understanding. The doctrine is clear. Every blip is an aircraft, every contact is real. To believe otherwise is to abandon the foundation of the entire defensive system. He tries to track individual returns, to isolate a single bomber and guide a fighter toward it, but the contacts merge and split, multiply and vanish. His night fighter pilot, circling somewhere in that chaos, radios back in frustration. He sees nothing. His own airborne radar is useless, swamped with false returns. The pilot's voice carries something Hoffmann has never heard before from a German aviator: confusion approaching panic. Below them, Hamburg is burning. The British bombers have come through unimpeded, navigating by the fires of their own pathfinders, dropping high explosives and incendiaries in patterns that will, over the coming nights, create the first true firestorm in human history. But in the radar hut at Stade, Werner Hoffmann watches his screen with a growing, sickening realization. The invisible shield has been shattered. The night has become opaque again, but now the darkness belongs to the enemy. The impact of window on German night defenses was immediate and catastrophic. In the first Hamburg raid, Bomber Command lost 12 aircraft out of 791 dispatched, a loss rate of 1.5%, compared to the 4 to 6% that had become grimly normal. Over the next 10 days, as the IAF returned again and again to Hamburg, the city was transformed into an inferno that killed an estimated 42,000 people and left 1 million homeless. The firestorm that consumed the city's center on the night of July 27 created temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, winds strong enough to uproot trees, and a mushroom cloud of smoke visible for 200 kilometers. But for the men tasked with defending the Reich's airspace, the physical destruction was matched by a psychological shock. The radar network that had been the pride of the Luftwaffe, the technological edge that had made Germany's skies a graveyard for British bombers, had been rendered nearly useless by strips of metal foil. The humiliation was profound. German radar operators had been trained to trust their equipment with absolute faith, to believe that what appeared on their screens represented objective reality. Now that reality had been shown to be manipulable, a construction that could be distorted by an enemy who understood its mechanisms better than the operators themselves. The German response was frantic and revealing. Engineers worked to modify radar equipment to filter out window returns, to distinguish between the slow-falling metal strips and actual aircraft. New frequencies were explored, new pulse patterns tested. The Luftwaffe reverted to older techniques. Searchlight batteries were reinforced. Ground observers were redeployed in greater numbers. Night fighter pilots were instructed to rely more on visual acquisition than radar guidance. Some of these measures showed promise, but they were reactive, improvisations born of desperation. The initiative had shifted, decisively and permanently. What had been revealed was not just a technical vulnerability, but a deeper limitation in German military culture. The Reich forces had been trained for operational excellence, to execute complex procedures with precision and discipline. They had not been trained to question the frameworks within which they operated, to imagine that the fundamental structure of their defensive system could be subverted. The British had done exactly that, and in doing so had demonstrated a flexibility, a willingness to attack problems from unexpected angles that would characterize Allied technological warfare for the remainder of the conflict. But window was only the beginning. Once the principle of radar countermeasures had been established, the evolution was rapid. The British developed Mandrel, a system of airborne transmitters that jammed German early warning radars by flooding their frequencies with noise. They deployed Tinsel, which allowed bombers to detect German night fighter radio communications and broadcast engine noise over the same frequencies, drowning out ground controllers' instructions. They created Airborne Cigar, a more sophisticated jamming system carried by specially equipped aircraft that could target multiple frequencies simultaneously. Each innovation forced the Germans to respond, to adapt their procedures and equipment, but they were always responding, always one step behind. The electromagnetic spectrum had become a domain of maneuver as important as physical geography, and in this domain, the British had seized the high ground. The most devastating elaboration of radar deception came with the development of Moonshine and Mandrel screen barrage, systems that could create phantom bomber streams, ghost formations that would appear on German radar as massive attacks against one target while the actual raid proceeded against another. On the night of June 5, 1944, D-Day Eve, British aircraft equipped with Moonshine flew precise patterns off the coast of Cap d'Antifer, their radar reflectors and transmitters creating the signature of a fleet of ships approaching the Pas-de-Calais. German radar operators tracked what appeared to be an invasion force, exactly where Hitler's high command expected the Allies to strike. Meanwhile, 150 kilometers to the west, the actual invasion fleet was approaching Normandy, shielded by a combination of jamming, low-altitude flight, and the German fixation on the phantom threat their own radars had revealed. The deception was multilayered, technically brilliant, and it contributed materially to the success of the largest amphibious invasion in history. It was also, in a profound sense, a fulfillment of the radar countermeasures philosophy that had begun with strips of aluminum foil over Hamburg. The Germans were not simply being blinded. They were being made to see things that did not exist, to commit their forces to defending against phantoms while the real threat struck elsewhere. There is a particular document preserved in the British National Archives, a post-war interrogation of General Major Joseph Kamhuber, the architect of Germany's night air defense system. In this interview, conducted in 1945 after the Reich collapse, Kamhuber speaks with remarkable candor about the moment window was first deployed. "We have believed our system was invulnerable," he says. "Not perfect, but fundamentally sound. The British showed us that soundness itself could be a weakness. They turned our strengths into vulnerabilities. Our precision became rigidity. Our trust in technology became credulity." There is no bitterness in his words, only a kind of exhausted recognition. He describes the frantic conferences in Berlin after Hamburg, the recriminations, the search for scapegoats. He mentions that German scientists had, in fact, developed their own version of window as early as 1942, but that its deployment had been delayed by bureaucratic caution and the fear of provoking British retaliation. When the British finally used the technique, German stockpiles of Doppel were rushed to Luftwaffe units for use against Allied bomber formations. But by then the British had already developed countermeasures to their own countermeasure, had moved several moves ahead in the game. Cam Huber's testimony is that of a competent officer confronting the reality that competence is not enough, that in technological warfare, the capacity for innovation and adaptation matters more than initial advantage. The symbolic weight of this technological reversal extends beyond the tactical and strategic impacts. For the soldiers and technicians of the Luftwaffe, men like Werner Hoffmann and Klaus Becker who had stood their watches believing in the supremacy of German engineering, the arrival of Window was an epistemological shock. It called into question the narrative that had sustained German military confidence since the beginning of the war, the belief that German technical superiority would compensate for material disadvantages, that the quality of German equipment and training would overwhelm Allied quantity. The radar war demonstrated that the Allies possessed not just quantity, but quality of a different kind. Not the quality of more powerful transmitters or more sensitive receivers, but the quality of strategic imagination, of seeing warfare as a contest of systems rather than equipment. The British had understood something the Germans had not, that every technology creates dependencies, and that dependencies are vulnerabilities. By attacking the dependence of German night defenses on radar, they had achieved an effect disproportionate to the simplicity of their means. As the war progressed, the elaboration of electronic warfare became ever more sophisticated. The Americans, entering the strategic bombing campaign with their daylight raids, developed their own suite of radar countermeasures. Carpet, a jammer that disrupted German flak-aiming radars. Rug, which confused ground-controlled interception radars. Rope, another refinement of the window concept using different chaff formulations for different radar frequencies. By late 1944, a typical Allied bombing raid was preceded and accompanied by invisible electronic barrage as complex as the physical bombing pattern itself. Specialized aircraft, fortresses and liberators stripped of their bombs and packed with transmitters and receivers, flew with the main formations, their crews monitoring the electromagnetic environment, identifying German radar emissions, and deploying countermeasures in real time. These were not just defensive measures. The Allies used their mastery of the radar spectrum to shape the battle, to channel German fighters into disadvantageous positions, to create gaps in coverage through which bombers could slip. The night sky over Europe became a place where battles were fought in dimensions invisible to human senses, where victory or defeat could be determined by technicians turning dials and flipping switches hundreds of kilometers from the actual explosions. For the German defenders, the progressive degradation of their radar capabilities induced a cumulative psychological strain that veterans would remember decades later with something approaching trauma. Heinz Schultz, a Würzburg operator who served from 1942 through the end of the war, recalled in a 1983 interview, "We went from gods to blind men in the space of 2 years. At first, we could see everything. We were the hunters, and the British were prey stumbling through our trap. Then came the jamming, the false returns, the ghosts. Every night became a guessing game. Was that contact real? Was the formation where the screen said it was, or somewhere else entirely? Our commanders still demanded precision, but precision had become impossible. We gave them coordinates, but we no longer believed in them ourselves. The worst was watching the bombers pass overhead, hearing the bombs fall, knowing they were there but unable to direct our fighters to them. It was like being paralyzed, having your eyes open but seeing nothing useful." This testimony captures the existential dimension of technological warfare, the way it can strip trained professionals of their sense of competence and agency, turning expertise into helplessness. There's, in the history of radar countermeasures, an object that recurs with almost mythic persistence, the bundle or window itself, that wrapped stack of aluminum strips carried in the bellies of British bombers. Crews developed rituals around it. Some gunners would kiss the bundles for luck before pushing them down the chutes. Navigators would time the drops with obsessive precision, knowing that proper spacing was essential to create a continuous cloud of false returns. The bundles were mundane things, wrapped in paper like Christmas presents, weighing a few kilograms each, utterly unimpressive to look at. But they represented something larger, the democratization of technological warfare, the idea that effectiveness did not require exotic materials or enormous expense, only understanding. where German radar stations were massive installations requiring concrete foundations and dedicated power supplies. Window was something that could be manufactured in warehouses by unskilled labor, distributed by the ton, and employed by ordinary aircrew with minimal training. This asymmetry, sophisticated defense defeated by simple offense, embodied a broader truth about the Allied approach to the war. They were willing to be crude if crudeness worked, to employ mass where the Germans relied on precision, to flood problems with solutions rather than seeking the single perfect answer. The Germans did eventually adapt. By 1945, they had developed the Naxos system, which could home in on the emission from British bomber navigation radars, turning the Allies' own electronics against them. They deployed the Lichtenstein SN-2 airborne radar, which operated on lower frequencies less susceptible to window interference. They trained night fighter pilots in new tactics, flying below the bomber stream to visually acquire aircraft silhouetted against searchlights and fires, relying on ground control vectors only for general positioning rather than precise interception. In the final year of the war, Luftwaffe night fighter kill rates actually increased despite overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. But these were desperate measures, innovations born of crisis management rather than strategic foresight. The initiative never returned to German hands. The Allies continued to refine their electronic warfare techniques faster than the Germans could counter them, and each new German adaptation required resources, trained personnel, manufacturing capacity, research time, that the shrinking Reich could increasingly ill afford. On the night of March 24, 1945, Klaus Becker, the same technician who had stood confidently beneath his Freya radar on Borkum Island 5 years earlier, is now stationed at a mobile radar unit near Paderborn, in what remains of Western Germany. The equipment is different, a newer model designed to resist Allied jamming, but the situation is hopeless. The Allies are across the Rhine. The sky is thick with their aircraft, hundreds of bombers and fighters flying in broad daylight now, barely bothering with electronic countermeasures because German defenses have been so degraded that deception is unnecessary. Becker's radar is functioning, tracking formations as they pass overhead, but there are no fighters to vector, no flak batteries with ammunition to spare. His reports go to a headquarters that may not even exist anymore, telephone lines cut, radio net silent. He thinks about the beginning, about those early months when every contact was an event, when shoot-downs were celebrated, when it seemed that German technology had granted them dominion over their own airspace. He thinks about Hamburg, about the night the screens went white with false returns and the certainty drained out of the system. He wonders if the British technicians who invented window understood what they were doing, not just tactically but symbolically, that they were breaking a spell, revealing that the Emperor had no clothes. In 3 weeks, Becker will surrender to American forces. He will spend 2 years in a POW camp, eventually returning to civilian life and a career in radio engineering. But he will never shake the memory of watching his radar screen dissolve into chaos, of feeling the invisible world he had mastered become suddenly irrevocably alien. The post-war assessments by British and American intelligence services paint a clear picture of the radar countermeasures campaign's impact. By conservative estimates, window and associated jamming techniques reduced Bomber Command's loss rates by at least 30% during the critical period from mid-1943 through the end of the war. This translated to thousands of aircraft saved, tens of thousands of aircrew who completed their tours and went home rather than dying over Germany. The strategic bombing campaign, which had been on the verge of operational bankruptcy in the spring of 1943, was revitalized and became, if not the war-winning weapon its advocates claimed, at least a sustainable strain on German resources and morale. The Germans never recovered the defensive advantage they had held in 1941 and 1942. Their night fighter force remained formidable to the end, but it was fighting blind, or partially blind, stabbing at shadows and ghosts. The technological confidence that had characterized the early war years was replaced by a grim recognition that the Allies had surpassed them in the invisible dimensions of combat, that the electromagnetic spectrum had become an Allied domain just as surely as the skies over Berlin. But the deeper significance of the radar countermeasures story lies not in the statistics, but in what it revealed about the nature of innovation under pressure. The British success was not the product of a single genius or breakthrough moment. It was a result of institutional structures that encouraged experimentation, that brought together diverse expertise, that were willing to question assumptions and test unorthodox ideas. The Telecommunications Research Establishment, where much of the countermeasures work was done, was a chaotic place by German military standards, physicists arguing with radio operators, junior officers contradicting senior ones, ideas tested and discarded with bewildering speed. It was inefficient in the sense that many paths were explored and abandoned, but it was efficient in the sense that it found solutions, and found them faster than a more hierarchical system could have managed. The Germans, for all their technical skill, operated within a more rigid framework. Innovations had to be approved up chains of command, justified to officers whose expertise was operational rather than technical, integrated into existing doctrines rather than forcing doctrines to adapt. This worked well for incremental improvements, but poorly for radical departures. Window was not an incremental improvement. It was a paradigm shift, and paradigm shifts require the freedom to think outside established frameworks. There is a photograph, taken in August 1943, that has become iconic in the literature on electronic warfare. It shows a British Lancaster bomber crew gathered around a pile of window bundles on the tarmac before a raid. The men are young, most in their early 20s, wearing fleece-lined flying jackets against the evening chill. They are smiling, not the false smiles of propaganda photos, but genuine expressions of relief and hope. These men know the statistics. They know that their chances of surviving a full tour of operations have been dismal. And now they are being told that these unimpressive bundles of foil will protect them, that the invisible shield that has been killing their friends and comrades can be negated by something so simple it seems like magic. There is no way to know if the men in this photograph survived the war, but the image captures a moment of technological hope, of the belief that human ingenuity can find answers to seemingly insurmountable problems. It is the opposite of the image we might imagine of Werner Hoffman staring at his chaotic radar screen. Where he experiences a collapse of certainty, they experience its restoration, a rebalancing of odds that had been tilted fatally against them. The legacy of the radar countermeasures campaign extended far beyond the Second World War. The techniques and principles developed between 1943 and 1945 became the foundation of modern electronic warfare, a discipline that is now central to military operations in every domain. The concept of attacking an adversary's senses rather than just their weapons, of fighting in the electromagnetic spectrum as vigorously as in physical space, of seeing the enemy's technological systems as vulnerabilities to be exploited rather than simply threats to be countered. These ideas trace their lineage directly to the men who scattered aluminum foil over Hamburg and jammed German radars with repurposed radio transmitters. The Cold War arms race included an electronic dimension as important as a nuclear one, with both sides developing ever more sophisticated means of detecting, deceiving, and disrupting each other's senses and communications. Modern stealth technology, which seeks to make aircraft invisible to radar through shape and materials rather than countermeasures, is a descendant of the same impulse that created Window, the recognition that if the enemy cannot see you, they cannot kill you. And in contemporary conflicts, where drones and precision weapons depend on electronic guidance and communication, the ability to dominate the electromagnetic spectrum often determines outcomes as decisively as firepower or numbers. As the sun sets on an evening in May 1945, over a Europe finally silent after 6 years of mechanized destruction, the radar stations that once ringed the Rai stand vacant or in ruins. Some have been destroyed by bombing, others simply abandoned as their operators fled or surrendered. A few continue to operate, now manned by Allied technical intelligence teams who study the equipment with professional interest, documenting frequencies and capabilities, measuring the sophistication of what the Germans had built. The Würzburg and Freya systems are impressive, the product of excellent engineering and careful manufacturing. In another context, in a different war, they might have been decisive. But war is not fought in laboratory conditions. War is adaptation and counter-adaptation, a competition not of static capabilities but of dynamic learning. The Germans built a shield, and the British found a way to make it transparent. That simple fact, repeated across 100 nights from Hamburg to Berlin, from the summer of 1943 to the spring of 1945, tells the story of radar's war within the war. There is a final image worth holding. Not of technology, but of human perception transformed. Imagine a British navigator, perhaps on his 15th mission, approaching the German coast in the darkness of February 1944. A year ago, this moment would have been one of pure dread. The knowledge that unseen eyes were watching, that fighters were being vectored toward him, that his bomber was illuminated on hostile screens across hundreds of kilometers. But now he listens to the static in his headphones, the crackle of German radar being overwhelmed by Allied jamming, and he watches out the window as the window bundles tumble behind his aircraft, a glittering trail of metal fragments catching moonlight as they fall. He knows that on the ground below, in some concrete bunker, German operators are staring at screens filled with chaos, unable to distinguish his aircraft from the hundreds of false returns surrounding it. He knows that he has become invisible not through darkness, but through an excessive visibility, through a multiplication of targets that renders the concept of targeting meaningless. This is not invulnerability. Flak can still reach him. A fighter might stumble across him through sheer chance, but it is something the crews desperately needed, a leveling of odds, a restoration of contingency to a battle that had become a mechanical slaughter. He does not think in these terms. He thinks, maybe tonight I'll make it home. And that thought, multiplied across thousands of aircrew, translated into the sustained prosecution of a bombing campaign that Germany could not stop and could not ignore, that forced the Luftwaffe to commit resources to home defense that were desperately needed on other fronts, that contributed its share to the vast accumulation of pressures that eventually broke the Reich's ability to continue fighting. The radar war was not won by a single innovation or battle. It was won by a philosophy, by an approach to technological competition that valued flexibility over perfection, rapid deployment over flawless design, systemic thinking over component optimization. The Germans had built better radars, in the sense of more powerful and more precise. But the British had built a better system for using radars, and more importantly, a better system for defeating their use. This distinction between the quality of tools and the quality of systems would echo through the remainder of the 20th century and into our own time. It is the difference between fighting the war you prepared for and adapting to the war you find yourself in. The Germans had prepared magnificently for the war they expected. The British, and later the Americans, proved better at improvising through the war they actually faced. And in that improvisation, in that willingness to question assumptions and exploit the unorthodox, lay a peculiar kind of freedom. Not the grand ideological freedom of propaganda, but the practical freedom to think differently, to challenge hierarchy with evidence, to value effectiveness over elegance. It was this freedom, as much as industrial capacity or manpower, that allowed the Allies to take a simple idea, strips of metal foil, and transform it into a weapon that blinded an empire and helped illuminate the path to its defeat. In the end, the Germans were shocked not by a radar innovation, but by the revelation that innovation itself could be a weapon, that the contest was not simply between machines but between systems of thought, between organizational cultures, between philosophies of how to learn and adapt. They had believed their technology made them safe, that their precision had mastered chaos. The Allies showed them that chaos could be weaponized, that precision itself could become a trap for those who relied on it absolutely. And every night, as British bombers found German cities through the electronic darkness that had once protected them, that lesson was written in fire and smoke across the Reich, a testament to the power of seeing warfare not as a test of strength alone, but as a competition of minds struggling to understand and outwit each other in dimensions both visible and invisible, both material and conceptual, where victory belongs not to those who build the strongest shield, but to those who learn. Fast is how to make shields irrelevant.